Okay, allowances versus reimbursements. Remember earlier today, Jan talked about accountable plans. So churches like to budget for the minister's expenses, right? We talked about budgets this afternoon. Churches like budgets, mostly. And once the item's budgeted for, a lot of churches go, well, we budgeted for it, let's just give it to the minister. So that's an allowance, right? We'll give you your car allowance, doesn't matter if you drive, we'll give you a book allowance, we'll give you a travel allowance. Has anyone ever seen this happen? Yes, right? Should it happen? No, and I'm going to show you why. Regardless of whether the minister incurs the expenses, they get this allowance. The minister gets to pay income tax and self-employment tax on that allowance. If you had an accountable plan, all right, they wouldn't pay tax on any of it. So, less than desirable from the minister's point of view. Allowances are also called non-accountable plan. Here's the characteristics of a non-accountable plan. The employee is not required to give you receipts or documentation. The employee is not required to return any excess money that you might have given them in advance, all right? As soon as, let me go here. You pay them regardless of whether you expect them to have business expenses. And you pay an amount as a reimbursement that you should have paid as wages. These are all things that make this a non-accountable plan and immediately make it income to your employee. This isn't just for ministers, this is true for any employee in any business, all right? Now, accountable plans require evidence of the expense and the business purpose from the employee before you get paid. They paid or incurred them while performing services for you. I did not do that. You're like, can anybody see to write notes or anything? Okay, don't worry about it. They have to substantiate the expense to you within a reasonable period of time. What happens if I do this? Oh, no, that's not it. Okay. Payments from the accountable plan are not income, and they are not wages, and are not subject to withholding or FICA or unemployment or anything else. However, the instant your accountable plan fails to do any of the things that it's required to do, it becomes immediately a non-accountable plan. All right? So set it up, put procedures into place, follow the procedures, don't let anybody not follow the procedures. All right? Very expensive to everybody. That's my spiel on accountable plans. They're really, really important. Please set one up. All right, independent contractors versus common law employees. Why does this matter? Employers have to treat independent contractors and common law employees differently. All right? If you have an independent contractor, you're not required to withhold taxes or pay taxes to anybody on their behalf.
So that'd be something like cut your church lawn, plow snow.
I'm not going to answer that yet, because we're going to go into how you tell who is an employee and an independent contractor. Thought that might be useful. But if you have an employee, you are required to do all that stuff, which is a lot more work, right? Yes. If you have incorrectly classified a worker as an independent contractor instead of an employee, you'll be liable for all the unpaid trust fund taxes, your share, that you should have been paying for at least the last 3 years. Okay? And the IRS has 20 factors that they consider in determining whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. They fall under 3 main categories, and those are behavioral control, financial control, and the type of relationship. So behavioral control. Who's in charge? Who directs? Who says what gets done when? Who controls the work? All right? Financial control. Does the employer have the right to control the worker's business aspects of the job? So for the extent to which the worker has unreimbursed business expenses, who controls that? The extent of the worker's investment in the facilities used in performing the services. It gets clearer. The extent to which the worker makes their services available to others. Getting clearer? You laughed. It was getting clear. How the business pays the worker, and whether the worker can realize a profit or incur a loss. An employee can't realize a profit or incur a loss. But if you hired a painter and they have their own painting business, they're an independent contractor, and whether they break even, make a profit, or incur a loss is not up to you, it's up to them. You with me? Are we good on financial control? Good. Type of relationship. What did they think about their relationship? Did they sign a contract? What did it say in the contract? Okay. Is the worker available to perform services to other businesses? That's again an independent contractor type trait. If they're not available, if they're working just for you, then they are your employee. Whether the business provides them with employee type benefits. If you're giving someone employee type business benefits, that maybe they're an employee type, right? How permanent is the relationship? And the extent to which the services performed by the worker are a key part of the regular business of the company, all right? This is a summary of the 20 factors that IRS will weigh. What IRS says is it's the facts on the ground in every individual case. But if you have behavioral control and financial control and the relationship looks like it's an employer-employee relationship, and you've been treating that person as an independent contractor because you couldn't be bothered, you're in trouble. All right? I know a lot of small employers, not churches yet that I know of. I've heard of a lot of smaller employers though who say, I'm going to have to cut my employees loose and re-employ them as independent contractors. That's a worse financial decision than keeping them, right? That's a bad decision. All right, on to clergy. Now, Jan was talking about payroll this morning and how I would cover it. Really, what I'm going to focus on is payroll for clergy. Because if you have FICA employees, it's easy to find information about how you pay a regular W-2 employee who has Social Security and Medicare wages withheld in other places. But you're not going to find information about how you pay your clergy. So I'm going to focus on that. I'd be happy to take questions on other stuff, but that's really the focus tonight. Is that okay?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Anytime.
So, okay, we've already addressed that I don't give out a W-2 to anybody in our church.
Yeah.
Okay, so, like my custodian,
Mm-hmm.
she is a member of our church, she's been a member forever.
Do you tell her when to clean the church?
I do not tell her when. She gets paid once a quarter.
We had a similar situation in our church where a member of the church was cleaning it and got paid monthly. We didn't tell her when. We didn't tell her how. And so we treated her as an independent contractor.
Just like the person who mows their lawn because he mows other lawns.
Yeah.
Now, I know in the business world, my old job, I would have given a 1099 to someone.
That you paid more than $600 in a year.
Right.
Yep.
But, you know, as I said before,
She has an interesting situation.
very small church, and my previous treasurer, who was a very long employee of a bank, never did any of this stuff. So even when I said, I'm not paying anybody until you show me a receipt, that like upset their world. But like, I've never done a W-2 or a 1099 for anybody for our church.
1099s are really, 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 really super easy.
Oh, I know they're easy.
You're not getting in
Actually,
trouble for that, but you have
for
to
my
do it.
business, but I've never.
If you paid them more than $600 in a year, you are required by law to issue a 1099.
I just wanted to get that verbal confirmation.
If they're another business, right? If you paid Lowe's $600 in a year plus, you don't have to issue them a 1099. But a contractor who works for you, you do have to issue. Yeah. Okay?
What did you say first?
Hey, who?
If you,
Like it's.
Look.
yeah,
Oh,
so if you
Lowe's.
paid Office Max, you bought stuff at Staples, you don't have to pay them. But if you hired someone to do work for you, and you paid them over $600 or $600 in a year, then you are required by law to issue them a 1099. So when you first hire them, you better get their social security number before you pay them.
That's even if it's a one-time.
Yeah, if it's one time and it's $600, yep. $600 is the cutoff, and you can issue a 1099 for less, but that is the point at which you must. Yeah.
So like a revival speaker
Mm-hmm.
that gets over 600, you have to give them a 1099.
Yes.
Even if they don't want it.
Yes. Which is why you should get their social security number before you pay them. Because you don't need to be part of their tax evasion equation. I'm not saying anybody that you work with is going to be trying to evade taxes, but the reality is that a lot of people think that if you get paid in cash, it's not taxable income. But I'm going to tell you what you already know. If you pay them in a chicken, that is taxable income. All right? I'm not kidding.
But they don't have social security.
Then you do not hire them. Because if they don't have a social security number, they might be illegal, and you don't want to go there either.
Well, and depending on your law, they may have a tax ID number, but if they don't have a tax ID number, you have to have a social security number. But I knew I wasn't the only one who was not doing all these 1099s. That's why I wanted to confirm this.
You get the W-9, you get the tax ID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and keep it on file.
But if you hire a company, you don't have to do this, do
No.
Well,
Unless it's if it's a sole proprietor,
you? Yeah. I mean,
then you do it. But if you're paying Office Max or Lowe's or a plumbing company, then no, I would not issue a plumbing company. What do you guys think? 1099? No, but I'm asking the accountants in the past.
Really, you wouldn't issue it to a plumbing company, even though that's?
Not if they're incorporated.
That's the
If
difference.
they're a sole proprietor, I would, but if they're incorporated, I would not.
Will an EIN distinguish between the two? If they have an EIN, you don't do one. If they have a social security number, you do.
So I think the safest thing for this answer is give one to everybody.
Give one to everybody.
And then let them, yeah.
Yeah, how's that gonna hurt you? The forms are cheap. You fill in your address and EIN, their address and tax ID number, whether it's an EIN or an SSN. And then you put one number in non-employee compensation. Box 7. Here you go.
So back to the example of the revival service.
Yes.
Say it's a $700 bill.
Uh-huh.
Could you pay $400 for the preaching and $300 for travel expense?
How much does that total in a year?
Not one
It's not based on where you're applying the expense, it's based on who you're.
How much
it's
today?
taxable.
It doesn't matter what it's for.
if the 300 is travel,
Mhm.
you get a statement, is that not accountable and therefore not included?
Well, I would say that if you paid the travel directly to the travel company,
Assuming they traveled 500 miles to come to our church, we
Uh-huh.
reimburse the 50-some cents a mile.
uh-huh,
And they give me a written statement, this is my travel expense.
what I do when that happens to me, okay? When I go someplace to give, like Bethany gives me now mileage and honoraria, which for many years they did not do. But Bethany doesn't pay 55.5 cents a mile. So instead of just reporting that as reimbursement, I report it all as income and then take my mileage at the full IRS rate off my tax return. All right? So you're not in charge of how they're going to deal with that on their taxes. I would issue a 1099 and I'd attach a letter. Here's the breakdown. Sound reasonable? It's easier, it's safer. Otherwise, you're doing too much thinking. Oh, is this taxable to them? Who cares? That's their problem.
And they should find some cheaper preachers.
My practice is almost 70% clergy. All right, my tax preparation practice is almost 70% clergy. And I have this one guy who's a bishop in an African-American church who preaches nationally and brings me amazing 1099s that I wish we saw in the Church of the Brethren. But he does bring me 1099s. Yeah. And that doesn't cover everything, because the stuff he does that's little, that's under $600, his wife reports to me. All right?
What about your organs now? Are they 1099 or?
Facts on the ground. normally I would say that your organist is probably not an employee of the church, but it depends on how much control you have over that person. I'm sorry. I've been in some churches where there was no control whatsoever over the organist. Sorry.
So elaborate on that, what do you mean by control?
Behavioral control, financial control, and type of relationship. So if an organist is somebody who also does recitals elsewhere, they might be in their own music business, in which case they might be an independent contractor. Usually they're a member of the church who likes to play the organ.
So what do you do with that? If you pay them, $50 a Sunday.
I would give that person a 1099 myself.
Are they the same every Sunday, or do you change? It's the same.
Same every Sunday, yeah.
I guess probably the good part is that's not a large amount of income to where they're probably gonna have any.
Stop. None of your business. I'm serious. As soon as you start worrying about what that's going to mean for them, you're not thinking about what your responsibility is for you. All right? So as soon as you say, well, that's not a large amount of income, I'm here to tell you that if you have $1 of income, actually 51 cents of income, that's taxable. Okay? I hear people say all the time, oh, well, my bank interest isn't taxable unless it's over $10, right? No. They don't have to send you a notice unless it's over $10. But if you got 51 cents, it's going to round up to $1, and that goes on your income tax return. I was reading yesterday, I should have read this a long time ago, and I said this to Ed this afternoon, the chat transcripts from the Bethany webinar, because I do that for 5 hours at Bethany. Okay, we do 3 hours of theory, and then we do a tax return from start to finish in the afternoon. You're all looking at me shell-shocked. This is a minister's return, all right? And meanwhile, Enton Eller is furiously answering questions while I'm talking, and a lot of the comments are like, what? She went too fast. What? She went too fast. What? She went too fast. But, oh, see, now, darn it, I lost where I was going to go with that. What were you talking about just before that?
You're talking about finding
51 cents. 51 cents.
51 cents is $1.
Yeah, so they were saying stuff like that, you know, if it's $10 or more, right? And I'm like, $1. Oh, and I gave the story where I have occasionally been given honoraria for leading worship in other, you know, for nonprofits. And after a while, I just got irritated because now I had to fill out a Schedule C. Well, I'm a taxpayer, that's not a big deal. But I was like, could you please not pay me? So I get this $50, and I'm reporting it on my Schedule C, and somebody wrote, did she really report that to $50? Yes. Okay, I worked really, really hard for my license from the Department of Treasury, and I'm not going to lose it. I'm not going to lose it for me, and I'm not going to lose it for you. And you should care just as much about the well-being of your church. Okay?
Do you know what the penalty is for not filing the 1099s when they're required?
No.
I understand it's $50 per return.
It could be, but I'll tell you what.
It's significant.
I have done good. He's saying it's $50 per return you should have filed. I will tell you that I've done a lot of audits, field audits with IRS agents, and they love going after people with Schedule C income because they think that there's unreported income there. If you have one 1099 that you have not filed, you're unlikely to get into a large amount of trouble with them. I'll tell you later how you will get into a large amount of trouble with them. That's not likely, but it could happen. You're correct.
I'm talking about the payor
Yes, you.
failing to do it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the treasurer who doesn't send it out.
right. But they're also going to look for a pattern of behavior to be really penalizing. And if you get in hot water with the IRS, call me, all right?
I was just gonna ask, like, am I presenting a huge red flag that I'm gonna all of a sudden start doing 1099s and I've never done this before?
No.
For these people? Like,
No.
is that gonna trigger something that?
No,
Okay.
no, do it.
Okay.
And you will have my card before you already have one.
Yes.
You will have, everyone who will have my card And when you go back and you get pushback, and I will say, I got lots more. So when you go back home and they go, well, I'm not gonna do that, you go, right here, 614-329-2966.
So it's better to give an ordinance a 1099 than W-2. Even though,
Is she an employee or not an employee?
well, I thought we employed her, but I don't know. I thought we did.
If you're telling her what to play and when to play it,
We did employ
an
her.
employee.
Typically, I think that employees have to be covered for workman's comp and unemployment insurance.
Mm-hmm,
And so a W-2 throws you in that category.
mm-hmm. Whereas, I don't know, I've met a lot of organists and I didn't have a whole lot of control over them, yeah.
On my workers' comp insurance form, I have to list independent contractors.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah,
In certain cases.
yeah. But
If
not
they don't
clergy,
have- If they don't have their own insurance.
right, but not clergy.
Pardon me?
Not clergy though.
Not clergy.
So how are we doing on the 1099 versus W-2 issue? You ready to go on to a W-2 you've never seen before? Yeah.
Roll on.
So how about an associate pastor?
Let's roll.
That is part-time.
Nice segue. Awesome. What the IRS really thinks about clergy. All right. I will hang out until they lock us up, okay? And last night I was here till about 10:30, 10:45, and they did lock us up. So if you have more questions, I will stay. No worries. That's why I like doing these at night, even though I heard this afternoon this was way past everybody's bedtime. I had 3 people who said, 9 o'clock's bedtime. So a hybrid employee does not mean that your clergy person gets more gas to the gallon, although some days you might think so. It actually means that they're both common law employees and independent contractors for purposes of taxation. So they're actual employees for purposes of income tax and retirement plans. They're independent contractors for purposes of self-employment tax. All of which means, well, I'm gonna get to that in a minute. And clergy, I bet you didn't know this, have 3 kinds of income. You pay them, and I bet you didn't know this. They have salary, they have housing allowance, and they have honoraria or self-employment. And each of these different kinds of income is treated differently. Typical clergy expenses, because I'm going to go into a lot of stuff here in a little bit. I wanted to spend the most time on housing allowance because that's the question I get the most from clergy and from churches. Business mileage, books. You see the little exclamation point next to books? I've never met a clergy person who could successfully convince me that they did not buy even 1 book in a year. Clergy love books. It's up to you to decide whether you're going to reimburse them for those books, okay? But they will buy them. Religious material, anointing oil, seminars and conferences, you're probably going to be reimbursing them for some of that. Fortunately, we don't have this rose, vestments, collar stuff, because they are, I don't know if you know how much those things cost. The stoles, $2,000 to $3,000 for one of those. Yes, yes. And our older pastors, from my husband's age in the mid-50s up, we used to buy a library, a hardback library, when we graduated from seminary. And now we do it all on the internet, so we don't have to depreciate that stuff anymore. The next screen I'm going to show you is a table that shows you what income to clergy are taxable to what forms of tax.
You're gonna send us all these if you sign up.
Yes, sir, as long as I can read your email address. So I want you to look at this. Here, let me get my nifty, what is it? Oh, here it is. Darth Vader laser pointer. My daughter's on a Star Wars fan. So I want you to look across here, all right? This first row, self-employment income, all of these tax treatments are exactly the same as any other self-employed person. Yes, the self-employment income is subject to income tax. It's subject to self-employment tax. It's not subject to FICA tax, Federal Insurance Contributions Act, right? Otherwise known as old age and disability insurance, Social Security tax, and Medicare tax, all right? Employee salary, subject to income tax. When we get to these red boxes, that means that this is how clergy treatment is different from everybody else. So employee salary is also subject to self-employment tax for clergy. It's not true for you, is it? No. And we're happy about that. Employee salary is not subject to FICA tax. That's not true for us either. And the housing allowance, or the fair rental value of the parsonage, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, is not subject to income tax, is not subject to FICA tax, but it is subject to self-employment tax. All right? So you'll see that nothing clergy makes that's clergy income, and I won't bother going through all those slides with you guys. They have to both be clergy, licensed, commissioned, or ordained, and they have to be doing ministry work for this to mean anything. If they're doing that, then nothing they make is FICA. So, you should never ever have FICA withholding on a clergy W-2. It does not matter if they're part-time, if they are a minister and they are doing ministry work. Doesn't matter if they work 1 hour a year for you. If they are ministers and they are doing ministry work, no FICA ever.
But
Yes.
by not withholding, by not taking anything out, that's certainly gonna reduce your social security that you're gonna get at the end. If you don't pay it.
Self-employment, that's what.
Okay.
So FICA is when the employer pays half and the employee has the other half withheld, right? Self-employment, the employee gets to pay both.
Uh-huh.
You can bet clergy are real excited about that.
Yeah,
And
but
these
it's
days,
not-
now that the payroll tax holiday is not here, it's back up to 15.3%. Yes, Brad.
Are you also going to address the issue of pastors who can opt out of Social Security?
I'm not sure if I had that in here because I didn't think that that was really appropriate for this group, but I did have it last night.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll talk briefly about that.
What about treatment of reimbursement for the self-employment tax? How is that treated?
Oh, I'm going to talk about that. Good question. Just not right yet. But I will, I promise. All right, so here are the clergy tax rules. These are true for clergy. You should know them. Here's what I did with the clicker. All clergy income is subject to self-employment tax. That's what SE stands for. All clergy income is subject to income tax unless it's excluded by designated housing allowance. More and more and more on that in a minute. Employers are prohibited by law from withholding FICA taxes for their clergy employee.
So they'd be paying 3 times.
They pay 150%. I'm going to talk about that later too. Okay? Don't do it. You're not helping them. All right? You're not helping you and you are not helping them. Employers must issue a W-2 to the clergy employee. Doesn't matter if they work 2 hours or 500 hours. If they are an employee, then you have to give them a W-2. If they're not an employee, then you can give them a 1099 miscellaneous. Itinerant preachers, okay? Revival preachers. Now, about the clergy W-2. What I want you to understand is that clergy are taxed under 2 tax systems, right? We have income tax and we have self-employment tax. All of the clergy income is subject to self-employment tax, but maybe only part of it is subject to income tax. You with me so far? Good, 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 good. The W-2 only has on it the part that's subject to income tax. The stuff that deals with self-employment tax does not appear on the W-2 except as informational. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So when you prepare a W-2, you put their compensation that is not housing allowance, so you have 2 parts of compensation, housing and salary. You add those together, you get total clergy compensation. Those are the 2 parts from you, right? Because honoraria comes from someplace else. You put the part that's salary on the W-2 and not the part that's housing. The clergy employee then reports all of it on their tax return and pays self-employment tax on the whole bundle. Why is this important? I have these Methodists in Cleveland who, young couple, both ministers, and they get moved every July 1st to different parsonages. Their W-2s are, I've been doing their taxes for a long time and they know what their W-2 should look like, and they're never correct. A couple years ago, after arguing with their church board, the treasurer admitted that I could call the treasurer from Columbus up to Cleveland. This is a black church. And I called the treasurer and he said, well, I don't know. I got advice from our accounting firm, ABC Accounting. And I just, personally, I find that hysterical. Not 1, 2, 3 accounting, but ABC Accounting. All right. So I call ABC Accounting, and I know I'm channeling their thoughts. What's this uppity white girl doing, telling us our business here in Cleveland? And what the woman said to me was, we wanted to make, because here's what they did. They put in box 1, they put the right amount, but then they added the housing allowance to the salary and put those in the FICA boxes. Yeah. Yeah. And then withheld FICA on it. So when I said this is illegal, they said, we just want to make absolutely sure that pastor pays everything he's supposed to. Sweetheart, he's paying everything he's supposed to. When I do this young couple's taxes, I have to leave the room, okay, for them to figure out how they're going to scrape up this money. The first time I did it, when after they first got married, they looked at each other and he said, that's more than we've spent on our wedding, and we've saved for 4 years to do that. Okay? This past year, his current church issued him a W-2 that was incorrect because I had their contract and I had their pay stubs. So I knew what the W-2 ought to be looking sort of like. Then they issued, I said it's wrong. So they issued a W-2C that was even more incorrect because they had hired a payroll company, more on that later, in September, and just taken the numbers off the year-to-date. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about January through August? I said, this is still wrong. And finally, I got so tired of it, I created a W-2C, but I gave the treasurer every opportunity first, okay? I created one, I said, give this to the treasurer and have her type this in, which she finally did, and we were finally able to file the return. But it shouldn't be that difficult. So trust me, your clergy employee is paying. Here is what a clergy W-2 should look like. Okay, so this is a little old church with brand new pastor, Happy Valley, Ohio. We'll find out, we would find out later if you were in my other class, he lives in a parsonage, but they're paying him $7,000 salary. They don't withhold income tax. They have no other employees, so they don't have any kind of setup, so you're not required to withhold income tax. You can. It's awful nice if you're able to. You're not required. They also know not to put FICA wages or withholding in. Here's the housing allowance. Box 14 is informational only. Those of you who get W-2s may know this. Box 14 does not affect any of the calculation on your tax return. It's only for information. Box 12 can affect your calculation. Box 14 does not. All right? So it's just for information. IRS says that you are not required to put the housing allowance amount in box 14, but I'm going to tell you that the less you make IRS think, the better for everyone. So type it in, all right? You don't want them wondering because that takes time, and when they spend time, the brain cells start going zzz. Okay, that's bad. Since I live in Ohio, we have state wages, we have local wages, so that's why I filled those in. If you live in Tennessee, for example, there'd be nothing down here. See how empty that looks? That's what it's supposed to look like. That's not incorrect, that's correct. Okay? You will have this slide, I promise. If I can read your email address. Okay? Now, remember I told you that one of the ways that we can reduce income tax for pastors is housing loans. Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, are you gonna talk about, how pensions, goes into that?
Well, I briefly did touch on it in that clergy are considered employees for pension purposes. And pension will consider your total clergy compensation when calculating pension. Not just your salary portion, but salary plus housing should be added together to determine the basis on which your pension is calculated.
She wants to know where you report it. He wants to know about reporting it in Box 12.
Oh, in here?
Yeah, I just want on the W-2, how it is here.
Box 12, like anybody else. Sorry, thank you, Tammy. Okay? All right, housing allowance. Churches often say to me, well, there's many things I hear from employers of clergy. One is, we're worried that, corporations tell me this, we're worried that we're getting a tax benefit by giving our clergy employee a housing allowance. And so because of that, we need to make sure that the clergy employee is spending that on housing, so we want copies of all their bills. As the employee, that's not your business. If the clergy employee is not spending all their housing allowance on housing, there are ways to deal with that, and that is their problem, okay? It's legal for your clergy employee to have 100% of their salary as housing. It's perfectly legal. It's not a flag for them or for you, all right? It's perfectly legal. And in fact, if you're not doing any withholding at all, that's what I recommend to clergy. Because they're already paying quarterly, they might as well make sure that they have every possible chance to spend all of their salary on housing if that's how it shakes out, okay? Yeah,
But you have to be able to back up your housing allowance, don't you?
the clergy does when the clergy
Yeah.
does his or her
Yeah,
tax
so you
return.
can't take the whole amount of salary, probably,
Really?
I wouldn't think.
What if you're married to somebody who makes a good income
Mm-hmm.
and all your salary pays for housing?
If you're part-time, let's say you only make 15,000.
Sure.
You know, if it's a pulpit fill situation.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of years ago who lived on a farm. He was a gentleman farmer, which otherwise is known as a hobby farmer, right? But they had a lot of land and they had bees and trees and stuff. And he made really good money and she made about $55,000 a year as a hospital chaplain. And all of her salary was housing allowance. What was most interesting is that her employer also withheld income tax for her. So she had 0 in box 1,
Right.
like $15,000 withholding in box 2, $55,000 in housing in box 14. Software wasn't fun, but that's legal. Okay, that's legal. That's their problem. Okay, that's not your problem. The other issue is for churches. You're going to you're going to determine total compensation that you're willing to pay your minister, right?
Right.
The proportion of that between salary and housing allowance does not matter to you at all. Let me repeat that. The proportion of that for housing and salary does not matter. If your employee wants a higher housing allowance, just make the salary smaller. It does not cost you anything.
So they can tell us how much they want us to apply of housing allowance, and that's perfectly fine?
They should.
Okay.
They should, because how do you know what they're going to spend?
Well, that's
Right.
good.
Okay, you should not be telling them. I know employers who do that. They have some kind of weird policy. Nobody gets more than $9,600 in housing. Why?
What if they had other reimbursable expenses? If you paid your pastor completely all housing allowance,
Uh-huh.
then they had like, say, travel expenses to visit people in the
Uh-huh.
hospital,
Yeah,
none of that income would be taxable that you reimburse for travel expenses, correct?
as long as it's an accountable plan,
As long as
that
they
is
had-
correct.
right, well, okay,
Yes,
Good.
yeah. You with me? Okay? They're not trying to cheat you or cheat the government. If they want all of their salary to be housing, they're trying to minimize their tax bill. So think about paying 15.3% on everything you make as clergy. And then let's assume they're in the lowest bracket of 10% for income tax. If they have to pay 10% on everything they make as clergy, what does that add up to, people? 25%. So they're trying to reduce their tax. And that's a good thing, because the less your clergy have to worry about money, the more they can be focused on doing ministry for you. Okay? They're like, oh, I don't know about this. Yeah.
I'm still
Especially this
stuck,
guy
I'm
back
still
here does
stuck
not
here.
know
Say,
that.
say you've got somebody making $60,000 as clergy,
Uh-huh.
and you're saying they can put 100% of that down as housing?
Yep.
But
It's their
don't-
problem.
Yeah, I know it's their problem. I know it's their problem, but I'm saying from the clergy aspect, you have to be able to back that up, that your housing costs that amount, right?
So here's what happens when you're clergy. Say I have $60,000 of housing allowance and I spend 40, okay? That's how much I can prove that I spent.
Mhm.
Because I had said that 60 would be my housing allowance and only 40 was spent, that leaves 20,000 that I was going to spend that I didn't. You with me?
Mhm.
That 20,000 gets added back into income on the front of their 1040 as wages.
By clergy.
So it's up to the clergy.
Not, the church doesn't care about
The
this at all.
church does not care. This is when the clergy person does their own tax return.
Right.
That's what happens. Now, if the downside to this for clergy who are being withheld, okay, with income tax, is that they might have had too little withheld. And so instead of getting a little refund, they might find themselves suddenly owing a lot of money that they weren't ready for. You with me? What if the church is in withholding?
You're gonna pay a lot.
They're already paying quarterly. See? Where's the downside? Okay, you with me?
Quarterly paid in.
That's their problem.
Then they're paying penalties.
Well,
Well, they'll only do that 1 year at a time, hon, okay? I'm
well, I
promising
know,
you.
but I mean, they're gonna come up with a big bill at the end. I mean, you know, when you get to that.
So they can declare all of their housing, their salary as housing, but they don't have to pay quarterlies based on that, right?
But if
They
don't
might have,
If they don't have enough paid in, they're gonna have a penalty.
they might pay anyhow. You don't know how much they're gonna decide to pay in quarterly. And they might have a spouse with a good job who can have more withholding taken out on their paycheck, which is even better.
Well, it may no longer be the church's problem, they're gonna have a problem.
It's not your church's, it's not ever your problem. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well,
I say, it's not the church's problem, but they're gonna have a
the
problem.
church does have to designate the housing allowance on paper.
Yes, the church does have to designate it in writing in an official kind of communication, like a minute, a council minute, or even an executive board or leadership team minute. It does have to be written down before the clergy person starts getting it. But the tax consequences to the clergy person are the clergy person's, okay? And so the best thing you can do, if your clergy person says, I want 100% of my salary to be housing allowance, you should say, we're happy to do that, but we also think you should call Deb Oskin. Remember what I said, I'm not gonna charge you or your clergy person unless I actually do work for you, okay? Advice, research, consultations, all free. All right? During tax season, I'm a lot longer getting back. Just saying. February, March, and April, give me a little extra time. Okay? Yeah.
What do you think about the worksheets that clergy can use to help calculate their housing allowance? Is there any value in having a church ask for a worksheet? Is that an appropriate thing if they were to ask for 100%?
Exactly. It doesn't matter to the church. And if the church thinks it matters, there's really no legal reason why that would be. So the church could be just really nosy or really overprotective or really not trusting the pastor, or there's something else going on there maybe that needs to be dealt with. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. There's all kinds of people in the world. I'm saying from the legal and financial point of view, it's not the church's problem.
Do you think
But
it's
here's
good?
what's legal to do.
Do you think it's good practice for pastors to volunteer to provide a worksheet to the congregation to help the congregation understand where they get their number for a housing allowance? Is that
Nope.
good?
I would think the congregation would.
I would really not do that, because it's gonna be
Congregation
hard
is only
enough.
gonna see you as a salary.
It's gonna be hard enough for the leadership team to understand how the housing allowance and salary work, and I would not go to the congregation with that. Now, I think eventually you could certainly explain it to people if you want to, but that's gonna be a complicated topic.
But you did say that it should be recorded in the council minutes.
The amount of
The
the
housing
housing allowance.
allowance that the pastor wants.
Yes.
So if you wanted to provide that sheet, I would only provide it to the members at a council meeting if you felt like you really needed to, but I wouldn't even.
Or board, it's just
It
be
can
board
be
minutes.
a
Right.
board minute, yeah, it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, yeah, let me rephrase it, I wasn't saying to the congregation, I was saying to the board or to the
Okay.
executive.
Okay. Other thoughts on that?
Just a thought on the pastor declaring 100% of their salary as housing. I guess somehow I'm thinking you ought to have like an FYI, because I don't think you want to see a pastor get in a financial bind and then have to deal with that situation.
I totally don't, that's why I do this.
Well, but I guess your stance is that's the pastor's problem, not the church's. But I do think, as the pastor being an employee, there is some responsibility there to some extent. It's like, FYI, are you aware that you potentially have a tax liability at the end of the year, as opposed to a sudden, like with a couple, that, hey, that took us 4 years to gather this much money.
Mhm.
Give them a heads up or ask a couple of questions. Do you really know what you're doing here? Sort of thing.
So I wouldn't say, do you really know what you're doing?
Correct. Yes.
I would say, have you been to any clergy tax workshops? Okay? Would you like the name of somebody who could help explain this to you? Or, when you go to annual conference this year, why don't you go see, the Office of Ministry does this clergy tax workshop insight session every year at their annual conference. Maybe that would be a good idea. Bethany now webcasts my all-day thing to ministers across the denomination. So there's no longer a geographical requirement. And in fact, Ed Neller asked me today if I'd be willing to do a webinar type thing for church treasurers. I don't know when yet, someplace out of McPherson. Although he said I didn't have to go to Kansas, so that's good. I'd probably have to get out of my jammies though. Okay, so I would do something like that, like we understand that's legal and that's your decision and we're fine with that, but we also want to make sure that you don't get in trouble. Because that's my goal, right? I was not told anything. When my husband became a pastor in the Northern Ohio Church of the Brethren district, we lived in parsonage right out of seminary. Moved in January 1st. Next year I did our taxes and the bill was every penny we had in the bank. And I've been doing our taxes for years and years. We've had Schedule C businesses. We've done all kinds of little stuff. And I thought I was pretty good at taxes. And I cried and cried and cried because I felt like I failed my family. So I don't want any minister to be in that situation. That's why I run around and do all this. That's why I tell you I will talk to anybody. All right? That's why I do it. It's a mission. So take a bunch of cards. I've got like 2 more boxes over here. And here we are at 10 till. And we haven't even touched housing allowance other than, should you do it, should you not do it? Yes, do it. Now, if your pastor lives in a parsonage, the fair rental value of the parsonage is income to the pastor. Let's be straight. The fair rental value of the parsonage is income to the pastor that they have to pay self-employment tax on. They did not get cash. And if you run out, I got more boxes, all right? If they didn't get cash, they got the benefit of living there, but they have to come up with cash to pay the tax. See the problem? Okay? So who comes up with the fair rental value of the parsonage? Well, some people say the church, some people say the pastor. I would say that you all ought to come to it together. It should be on the low end of reasonable for your area. Because if you jack it up, here's what I know some churches, not saying what denomination, have done in the past. They couldn't pay scale, so they jacked up the value of the parsonage. So that when you add the parsonage to the cash they could give you, suddenly they were at scale. Does that help the minister? No. No. not even for a minute, thinking that they might be making scale. It doesn't help the minister. Just don't pay scale, okay? Don't jack up the value of the parsonage because they're going to pay 15% on that. Ouch. Now, a housing allowance, like we've been saying, has to be written down first. All right? Whoever comes up with the amount, it has to be written down in some kind of official paper form. Then the minister can start getting that money. If something happens mid-year and say the roof comes off the minister's house and they need a higher housing allowance, you can change it. All right? They can only take those extra higher housing expenses after that next amount was set. You with me? So it's always prospective. You can never look back at the end of the year and go, I spent $46,000. That's what my housing allowance is going to be. If only. That would be awesome. You have to do it ahead of time, all right? And sometimes when you're a new pastor, it will take a while to figure out what stuff costs. And when you move, it can take a while to figure out what stuff costs. So they might be moving in every year. You might be being asked to change it mid-year. Help them out, all right? And remember that you're not changing your total compensation. You're just shifting how much is housing and how much is salary. This is not costing you anything other than the ink to write it down. You're already meeting, so not a problem. So the amount has to be used to provide or rent the home, not the homes. There is a court case working its way through right now, and the last decision was no, one home at a time. And but the decision before that was yes, 2 homes were fine. I don't think so. I think where you sleep, that's the home. But if the Supreme Court changes that, I will let you know. And it can't be for the reasonable pay for the minister's services. We heard that this afternoon, didn't we? Like if somebody was going to pay $435,000 to their pastor, that might not be reasonable pay in the church of the brethren. But somebody next to me was saying, you get a lot of pastors asking for that job, though.
Guaranteed.
Only pastors make big money on what's on TV.
So there's 3 amounts that the pastor has to know when the pastor does his taxes, her taxes. The amount they actually spent, all right? They have to add this up. They can't just guess at the end of the year unless they're doing it themselves, in which case they're guessing it a lot more than just that. They're coming to me, or Brad, they're not guessing, they're coming up with numbers. The amount that was actually designated, which hopefully you put on the W-2 because we don't want the IRS to be confused. We repeat that. We don't want the IRS to be confused. And the fair rental value of the home that they own, okay? So the parsonage thing I talked about, that was just that one screen. All of these other rules are for homes that the pastor owns or is buying from the bank, for those of us who have that definition of a home that's owned. Beverly J. Worth in Indianapolis, who writes Minister's Guide to Taxes every year, and she's done it since 1973. She says that a rough calculation could be taking the Zillow.com fair market value, that's a real estate site, and multiplying that by 1% times 12 months to get a rough fair rental value of the home. The reason why we have to do something other than ask a realtor what's the fair rental value of homes in the area is because for this calculation, the fair rental value of the minister's home includes everything in it. Okay? Not an empty house, the way a realtor would tell you, but everything in it. And since I'm being filmed, I won't tell them what I told everybody last time. Here are some typical housing expenses for ministers. It's not complete, although I do want you to notice that under utilities, internet and cable TV are okay. Do you see the word cell phone here? If you have a tax preparer personally who tells you that you can deduct your cell phone expenses, it's really, really hard to do that and very, very rare specific situations. So I would be skeptical. They're not caught up yet. I wish they were. They know they ought to be. It is certainly an ordinary and necessary business expense for the world, but they're not with it. But you can see over here for housing, it's just about everything. You know, when the tall high school boys in our neighborhood graduated, this little kid who was just barely taller than his shovel came by my house. And I thought, well, I'm gonna nurture this kid for when he gets bigger. So I gave him 20 bucks, and then I had to go out and shovel after him. But I took that 20 bucks off on my husband's housing allowance, so.
So when we meet and record it in our minutes about how much is going to be applied to housing allowance, our pastor, do they need to tell us the amount, or can they say we would like 100%?
They can tell you a percent or a dollar amount, yes. And those of you who have been part of filling out pastors' contracts, anybody here? A couple. So you'll notice that there's a place where the pastor sets aside part of their money as housing, and there's also a place where church can kick in some money as housing. And hardly anybody knows both of those, but if you do, both of those added together is the total housing, okay? So the rest of you don't worry about it unless you're looking at a contract from Church of the Brethren, yeah.
I just started in September of last year. So the question is for the first year pastor,
Yes,
and I established a housing allowance.
yes, good.
Is that prorated or is it the full amount? Because what ended up happening was we prorated that. But I don't think, but I spent more than what the prorated amount was, my actual expenses. You understand?
Well, so if your contract started, say, September 1st, and they wrote it for a year, and they would have written a year's worth of housing, and then at the end of the year, you had been there September, October, November, December, 4 months, they would have given you 4 months of housing expenses on your W-2, because you're a calendar year tax filer. See, that's why it's not.
I was a minister beforehand though. I've been a
Uh-huh.
minister all year. I had
Okay.
a housing allowance previously,
Yeah.
which was a little bit different.
Well, it should break down to the yearly amount divided by 12 times the number of months in the calendar year that you were there. So we might need to talk later. Okay, any other questions so far? Good, so, because it's like 10 o'clock and I'm just getting to the part that most interests you. Problems, issues, solutions, gifts versus salary. IRS likes to categorize things based on what they are and not on what you call them. So because you call it a love offering to your pastor does not mean it's a gift. The courts have found over and over that if the pastor continues in the job, gifts are compensation for services. I had somebody last night tell me that someone in the church takes once a year a great big manila envelope, passes it around, it gets filled up with cash, they hand it directly to the pastor. The treasurer never knows what's in that envelope, okay? And I said, okay, so from now on, that's not happening. They can still do that if you want, but you have to intercept that envelope before it goes to the pastor and count it. Because the treasurer needs to know how much should go on that pastor's W-2. It came from the church. Just because it didn't come through the church budget doesn't mean it didn't come through the church, all right? You can still hand them the envelope, just make sure you know how much was in there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Don't let them do stuff like that. Oh my
Well, better
gosh.
off having document what they gave and they can deduct it on theirs.
Well, see, if you're stuffing cash in an envelope, you're not deducting that. Okay, here's what I want. I want everyone here. Never put cash in a basket. Never, 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 never. Write a check. If you don't have envelopes, write a check. Okay? Cash in a basket is a coin in a fountain. You know? If you want to be able to deduct it as a charitable contribution, you got to be able to track it, and cash is not trackable. All right? Courts also say that if you are giving your clergy person a retirement gift and they're leaving, then that's a gift. Because there's no future expectation for services. See, now you're starting to wonder, why is mine not working anymore? How many times has she dropped ours? Gross up, we did talk about this. I said I was going to talk about this. Employers who notice that they're paying FICA, half of FICA for their other employees, might want to give the half of FICA that they're not paying for their clergy person to the clergy person. You with me? You can do this. This is legal. And in fact, IRS has a formula to allow you to gross it up so that by the time the clergy person pays income tax on it, not self-employment tax, but income tax, what they're left with is the amount you intended them to have. So if you want them to have, say, $3,200, you can give them whatever the formula say, let's say it's 35, they pay $300 income tax on it, they still have the 32 you wanted them to have. Go to 15A, publication 15A, chapter 4, there's a formula in there, all right? Oh yeah, that goes into box 1 of your W-2 because that is income, all right? But more money is better than less money. If your pastor says, if you say, I want to help you pay your self-employment tax, so we're going to give you extra money, but you're going to also have to pay tax on it. Look, there is no tax rate in the United States for income tax that is 100% of the amount that you get, all right? Even if you hit the lottery, which of course none of us here would ever hit the lottery, although that's my husband's pension plan. Even if you hit the lottery and you have to pay like 70%, you still have 30% that you didn't have before, all right? So if they complain, whoa, I don't want to pay tax on it, okay, but that's money you're leaving behind, that's kind of silly. W-2, remember that W-2 I showed you that had brand new pastor working at little old church? Box 1, here's how you check them. Box 1 plus box 14 equals your total clergy compensation. Okay, box 1, and you're going to have these slides. Double check the housing allowance that you write in box 14. Go back and check the pastor's contract. Check the amount that was written down and designated. Make sure that they are close. You know, as you pay things out, you're going to be off by a nickel or a dollar rounding over the year, but it ought to be close. Unlike this other guy that I told you about who was supposed to get $10,000 in housing and had $1,993 reported on his W-2. Not close, all right? So double check that. If you have treasurers back home who will not listen to you and like to put FICA wages on because they want to make darn sure that pastor is paying their, taxes. But they know they're not supposed to withhold FICA taxes, so they leave those blank. Here's what happens. IRS and Social Security will send them a letter asking them for their unpaid trust fund taxes. They'll say, so glad to see you have an employee. Now you owe us $20,000. And it usually is 5 digits. I've seen 2 churches recently have that happen to them. So if they won't listen to you about putting numbers in those FICA wage boxes, 3 and 5, say okay. Okay, they'll get a letter from SSA because SSA will hop right on that. And once they get that, that should get their attention. If you have a W-2 for your clergy employee that has both FICA wages and FICA withholding, I'm almost. I want you to know that FICA withholding cannot be credited on the clergy person's tax return against their self-employment tax. So if you withhold FICA for them, thinking that you're doing them a favor, what you're doing is causing them to pay 150% of the self-employment tax that they owe. All right? Because you've already taken 50 and given it to the government, and on their tax return, they have to pay 100%. There are ways that I can help them get that back, but it takes months. Just don't do it. Any of you who right now, as of this moment, have been withholding FICA for your clergy employees have the opportunity right now to fix it for 2013. You know, if you're filing a 941 quarterly, you can take a credit against your next filing. You don't even have to come up with the money. Just take a credit against it. Make sure that you've got nothing left, right? Clear it all off and make sure that next year's W-2 has no FICA on it. Office and home. Even if you require the clergy employee to have an office in their home, if they have excluded their housing expenses with a housing allowance, they can't take it. Most churches will provide, a place for a clergy to work, so this is not a common thing, although I've had several people who say, but it's for a non-clergy business, but it's for my wife's business, but it's for... No, sorry. The last 2 slides are publications. This is how I knew it was 1828, because I already had it on my slide. See, I wasn't that brilliant. Pub 517 is the IRS publication for clergy. 15A, Chapter 4, that's the one where the gross up is, and it states clearly in there, issue your clergy employee a W-2. People say, can I just give them a 1099 because we're not withholding? W-2. 1828 has that nice guide for churches. Minister's Audit Techniques Guide is the guide that tells IRS auditors what to look like, what to look for when they're auditing a clergy person. So that might be a little technical. This second page are things that apply to really most any employee who has travel expenses, charitable contributions, business expenses. All of this can be found if you go to www.irs.gov.